For centuries, Korea held its own between enormous regional powers like China and Japan. The end of the 19th century proved to be the point that Korea shed itself of the old imperial Chinese tributary, and eventually the establishment of a Korean empire in name only that was largely influenced by Japan and set up for Korea's eventual annexation. It was a complicated, highly political, and in many ways violent end to a nation that was always forced into regional politics. But what happened to Korea after it was annexed by Japan? How did the people live? What changed, and what stayed the same? How is it observed today? Today, let's answer the question of, what really happened during Japan's occupation of Korea? On August 29, 1910, the Korean Empire ceased to legally exist and the entire Korean peninsula legally became a part of Japan. The effects were immediate and some major changes were made, starting with the royal family. Gojong, who had been forced to abdicate in 1907, was reduced to the title of Itaewang, while his son Sunjong, the last emperor of Korea, became Iwang. Surprisingly, the Korean royal family was not expelled or executed. Instead, Japan incorporated the dynasty into the colonial imperial order, granting its members titles, honors, and substantial allowances while placing them under Japanese control, which some accepted publicly while others deeply opposed it, most notably Prince Igang. A decade after the annexation, Prince Igang publicly attempted to flee to Shanghai to work with the provincial government of Korea in Shanghai, stating, "I would rather become an ordinary citizen of an independent Korea than become a member of the Japanese imperial family after the annexation." He was intercepted by the Japanese and locked down in Korea, but this action by a member of the imperial family served as a symbol of resistance to this day. Even before annexation, Japanese influence had already deeply penetrated many aspects of Korean life. With an official annexation, the groundwork that was laid for over a decade by Japan simply became law and was allowed to freely grow even more oppressive. The creation of the Government General of Korea, known as the Joseon Chongdokbu, was headed by the Governor General, and Japanese police and military became even more visible than before. With enormous civil, military, legislative, and administrative power, the Governor General made immediate efforts to assimilate Korea into Japan, starting with suppression. In order for there to be control, many aspects of Korean life had to be suppressed. Korean political organizations were essentially dismantled as newspapers and word of mouth through resistance fighters could easily create situations difficult to control. Because of armed resistance attempts even before the annexation, weapons were confiscated, surveillance was made more widespread, and people suspected of resistance were arrested. Newspapers were some of the biggest influences on major change during the late Joseon and Korean Empire periods, and Japan knew that in order to control political thought, the press would have to be controlled as well. Newspapers and publications were heavily censored and released with the ultimate permission of the Japanese, allowing for an easy control of information disseminating throughout the entire peninsula. By far the most important aspect of control was how to get the former aristocratic class and the commoners to support the newly installed Japanese government. The aristocratic former Yangban class still held a lot of influence and power in society despite the abolition of the class system by the Gabo reforms. Japanese officials approached the former Yangban class and offered titles, power, government positions, and money to many in an effort to fold them into the new government, as opposed to eliminating them. Many did take these offers, while others went on to join the independence movement. The Land Survey Project beginning in 1910 radically changed the legal administration of land. Owners were required to formally declare and register their holdings, and land that was not successfully registered could be classified as state property. The process disadvantaged some Koreans whose customary or informal claims were difficult to document, while the colonial government accumulated substantial land that was subsequently transferred or sold to Japanese companies and landowners. many former landowners became tenants to other Korean landowners who had collaborated with the Japanese, forcing a strong imbalance of land ownership and wealth. Despite the massive oppression of the Korean people by the Japanese, Japan also invested heavily into the infrastructure of Korea, which effects can still be felt today. The rail network snaking across the entire Korean peninsula was heavily developed during this time, linking many major cities and creating a cohesive transportation network. They were also linked to heavily developed port cities such as Busan, which allowed for more efficient maritime trading. Roads and urban infrastructure was also heavily developed, transforming Seoul from an ancient capital to a modern hub of industry and commerce. While electricity was not completely absent before Japanese industrialization of Korea, Japan invested heavily into electricity infrastructure throughout many major cities, quickly modernizing the heavy industrial areas. It is important to note that while these developments certainly were beneficial in modernizing Korea, it was done with the idea of Korea being a part of the Japanese Empire and was not done strictly to develop and better the Korean nation. These developments can still be seen today, with the modern footprint of the Korean rail system, electricity grid systems, and in many buildings such as the original Seoul Station, the former Seoul City Hall, and the former Bank of Korea. During the 1930s, Korea was forced into a far more aggressive assimilation process. Education was one of the things that was particularly concentrated on, with Japanese influence permeating Korea's future generation. Imperial Japanese ideology such as reverence to the Japanese emperor, Japanese language, and an emphasis on Japanese history was mandated. Traditional Korean cultural activity and Korean language was heavily discouraged, with many Koreans only speaking it behind closed doors and in spaces free of prying eyes. The Soshikaime policy adopted in 1939, quote-unquote, allowed and strongly encouraged Koreans to adopt a Japanese name. While not legally mandated, it was strongly pressured under the guise of successful social integration and opportunity in the Japanese Empire. The Japanese religion of Shintoism was also heavily promoted during this time as well, with the government erecting several Shinto shrines erected all throughout Korea, with the largest being located in Seoul. As Japan worked its conquests through Asia, World War II was on the doorstep of Korea, and the colonization would quickly take drastic measures in the name of the war effort. World War II brought on an even stricter and more aggressive approach to colonization. With the resources needed for a major war effort, many Koreans were forced into the labor markets to manufacture goods for the war effort. Factories, shipyards, and mines were manned all throughout the peninsula with Korean workers, and many were shipped to Japan when personnel were required. Despite a volunteer soldier system having been implemented previously, conscription was also mandated in 1944, meaning many Koreans were forced to join the war effort through duty as a soldier of the Empire of Japan. Women also joined the war effort as well, as factory workers through the Women's Volunteer Labor Corps, or famously noted by academics, conscripted, misled, or coerced into comfort women, who were sent all around Asia to provide sexual services to Japanese troops. The story of these women deserves its own video, as some are still alive today and still protest their treatment during the war and the lack of Japanese accountability to this day. During World War II, Korean resistance continued both inside Korea and abroad. Korean independence activists operated across China, Manchuria, and other parts of Asia, organizing armed resistance, gathering intelligence, and working to maintain the cause of Korean independence. The Korean provincial government in China established the Korean Liberation Army in 1940, which fought alongside the Chinese and eventually other Allied forces. Korean independence activists also established connections with the United States and other Allied powers, hoping to help liberate Korea when Japan was defeated. Despite these efforts, Korean resistance forces never had the opportunity to lead a full-scale liberation of the peninsula. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, ending 35 years of colonial rule and finally bringing Korea's independence. The World War II era was perhaps the most intense when it came to Korean identity suppression and unfair utilization of an entire nation. With over 100 years passing since the annexation of Korea by Japan, the perception of history in hindsight has changed somewhat from the post-liberation era. Figures from the royal family are viewed with a noticeable degree of understanding. Emperor Gojong, despite being perceived as a weak ruler, is widely regarded as trying to save Korea from Japan by sending for international assistance and opposing Japanese rule of Korea. Prince Yi-gang is recognized by many as being an independence resistance activist who did everything he could within his confined and closely monitored role as a member of the Korean royal family. In the 21st century, South Korea has also revisited the issue of collaboration. A 2005 special law allowed the state to confiscate property determined to have been acquired as a reward for collaboration with Japanese imperial rule. The law targeted qualifying property itself rather than simply punishing descendants for their ancestry. Every year, the celebration of Liberation Day and the independence fighters who helped fight Japanese oppression reminds the nation of how South Korea has come to exist, how it is today. In remembering the heroes who died for Korea, the country is able to build and establish itself as its own modern nation. If you like this video, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe so you can see more videos just like this.